Welcome to the Working It Out podcast. This is the first episode of our new series where we're adding a little twist to our set of questions. On top of the usual exploration into a person's relationship with physical activity, we're also digging into the root causes of inactivity and casting the conversation over to yourselves on LinkedIn to get your thoughts and feelings. Got a big guest first to kick off. It is our very own CEO of Sport England, Tim Hollingsworth. Hello, Tim. Welcome to the Working It Out community.
Good afternoon, Alex. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to be the first guest of the new series.
No problem at all. I thought we'll kick off with a bang. So what we do first with the Working Out community is we have a large locker where we invite all of our guests to put one item into it about their relationship with physical activity. We've had Lauren Steadman, GB athlete, where she put in her avocado socks when she went to the European Championships. She forgot to bring her specialized socks that was perfect for training, so she actually won a European Championships in a pair of H&M socks. So they're in the locker, special. And then we've got Bourne Barracle's pull-up bar because Bourne loves a pull-up and things like that. Is there a specific item that you would like to put into our locker?
Yeah, thanks for putting me in the same category as Lauren and Bourne for this sort of thing. I mean, people I know well, both, particularly Lauren, is one of the truly fantastic Paralympians of the last 8 years or so. I thought about this actually because you gave me a bit of a heads up that this would be a question, and I've settled very keenly on something from. It's actually an indoor home rowing machine.
Mm-hmm.
It's made by a company called JLL, and it's probably about a tenth of the price of a Concept 2, and it was very sort of cheap and cheerful. But 3 weeks into lockdown in 2020, I had a bit of space in the house to have something like this. I decided that I would get off Amazon a rowing machine with the view that it might add both to my and my son's sort of exercise that we were able to do and allowed to do. And I didn't realise, I was quite pleased that it arrived while I was addressing the whole organisation. So I literally answered the door to a man delivering me a rowing machine, which I thought was pretty good for Sport England. Secondly, I had to assemble it, so I was quite pleased with myself for that. But most importantly, why I've chosen it, it's become quite a profoundly important bit of kit for me. Mm-hmm. It saw me through that period every morning, usually with the Today programme on, as I listened to the latest news of what COVID was doing to the country and to society. And I could sit and I could stare out of the window where it was situated and even in short bursts, just, get a bit of my blood flowing and my energy going in the mornings. And so for all of that period and for quite a long time afterwards, it was a daily part of my routine and my life. I've had a bit of work done recently in the house, which has enabled me to get it back out again. I'm not here every morning now, unfortunately, for that respect, because of the way that life is and Sport England is. But still, when I'm here, it's a way to start the day. So actually, it's a pretty profound piece of kit for me. It's a bit of, I know it's not a pair of socks, but of all the equipment in recent years, that sort of spur of the moment almost decision to get myself something that I could use every day is what I would choose.
I was trying to predict the item because I just a game I like to play with myself of what someone would say, and I was doing my digging into history, and I've listened to multiple podcasts. I've heard about how your sporting moment you'd like to achieve was to hit a Test century at Lords, if I've got that correctly, and then
that would do. There's a number, but that would do. Certainly,
scoring a goal at Fulham. So I felt like it would be a sporty item. So yeah, it's got an indoor rowing machine. So is that some sport which you do regularly? Was that one that you did as a child?
I never rowed on water. I actually saw it very much in the context of physical activity and well-being rather than sport. It was, in the same way that, if I am in a gym, I might jump on the rower to warm up rather than a bike or a treadmill. Mm-hmm. Seems to me to be a good exercise for me. No, all those things that you listed, absolutely. But I don't possess the equipment because I was never any good at those. The reality was never going to happen. It's not like Lauren and her, I won my European Championships in these socks.
Yeah.
This is not the bat. I'm not giving you the bat that I scored my century at Lords with. I would be far more likely to give you my sort of empty pint of beer or my picnic hamper if I was at Lords, because I tend to spend time watching cricket there, not playing. The reality for me was it felt very practically something that's very real in my relationship with being physically active, which is it was in lockdown an essential part of how I started every day. Get my thoughts together, and also get the blood flowing in a way that meant a lot. And so I've chosen that.
That's amazing. So we'll lock that in the locker. Thank you very much. I
Mhm.
think what we will do next, we'll jump into a bit about yourself, and if you could introduce your role. And I've mentioned that you're CEO of Sport England, but your role and what its link is to physical activity for those who
Sure.
maybe are listening from different sectors.
Yeah, and I completely get that it won't be as apparent to some as to others. Yeah, no, I've been chief executive of Sport England since November 2018, so I'm now
Mm,
into my sixth full year. And my two primary shapings, the things that have shaped that time, one, obviously the pandemic and everything that that did to sport and physical activity in this country, and also the way in which it forced us to think and behave differently. But secondly, also, it's just over 3 years since we published our strategy, Uniting the Movement,
mhm,
which was a transformational approach to Sport England and how we operate and how we work, and really reversed the long held assumption that more people playing sport is the answer to a more active nation.
mm,
Actually, what Uniting the Movement is underpinned by is the belief that a more active nation is the answer to more people playing sport, but also there is a good deal more that we can benefit from investing in, supporting, and driving people to be more active in their everyday lives for all the
mhm,
physical and mental benefits that can accrue. But I think increasingly we're realizing too, in order to connect them better to themselves and to the communities around them. So I'm basically responsible. Well, actually, no. There's lots of people in sporting that are responsible for stuff, including you, Alex. I'm accountable. I'm
mhm,
accountable for Sport England as the chief executive. It's my job to make sure that we have first the opportunities, the resources, the capacity, the capability, the space, the relationships, the credibility
mhm,
to deliver, and then secondly, increasingly in this political age, to make sure that as a government agency, as an arm's length body responsible for both exchequer and lottery investment, we have best part of £300 million a year to invest. For those that don't know, so it's a substantial sum,
mm,
but I can't remember the exact figure, but it equates to something like 18 hours of the NHS budget. So if you are talking about
mm.
what we're spending on trying to get the nation healthier and more active, you can see the potential value of that. And our link to physical activity, therefore, is profound. The whole purpose of uniting the movement is when we move more, we're stronger as a nation, as individuals,
Mhm.
and as a society. And my job as CEO is to create the conditions for that to happen and then to account for the decisions that we make in delivering it.
I wouldn't be saying these types of things to every CEO, but as for those who don't know my history and why I'm interested in having you first and getting into a bit about your personal relationship with physical activity, because my personal relationship was always linked to an organization close to my heart called Greenhouse. We won't go into them a lot today,
Mm.
but a coach who influenced me a lot was a coach called Tony. I've spoken about him on a previous series, but I found a passion for sport and physical activity because he challenged me to be the CEO of Sport England. And I didn't know what that meant at the time. I didn't know what that role did, but the part of being accountable is the part which at the
Mm.
time sounded cool.
Yeah.
Some people may not, some people may not think the same, but I was like, that's got to be a cool thing, being accountable. But I can imagine the pressure's quite high. So, but that's given me it gave me a sense of purpose knowing that there was an organization, a role to aim towards. Not saying that I'm coming
Mm.
for your job, but it was always giving me
I hope you are. I really hope you are. It might be a couple of years yet, but
yeah.
absolutely. I hope there's lots of people that would aspire to
Mm,
this job. It doesn't come without challenge. It doesn't
mm,
come without high, moments of pressure, for want of a better
mm,
word. I'm not trying not to use the word stress, but
yeah.
there's obviously a clear amount of responsibility and accountability. I think it's quite important to make that distinction. If I was responsible for everything in Sport England, we would fail. Lots of people
Mm,
have day to day responsibility for making sure we're doing the best we can do for those we're seeking to serve. But you weigh that against the accountability, and it's a
mm,
real privilege because you feel actually you've got some levers and some opportunity to affect change. And if that's a motivation and if that's a belief, then that I think is the key, should be the key driver of a chief executive.
mm.
It's a very distinct and different role because of that accountability. But the privilege in it is your chance to take something forward with a knowledge that you can actually affect it and influence it.
Yeah, that just it's motivating. For me, it's always given me that direction, because I didn't know what I wanted to do before that greenhouse coach challenged me to do that. So I was like, right, I was failing GCSEs, I had no idea what I wanted to do, and it gave me that real
Yeah.
purpose to
What a brilliant
progress.
coach. What a brilliant
Yeah,
conversation.
that's why I continue now to advocate for them,
Yeah.
and always drop them in where I can. But what we're going to do today is dig into your relationship with physical activity. We've done a bit in terms of the item you'll put in the locker. What I'd be interested to know is, when it comes to physical activity, if I say, let's do some activity, what one emotion do you feel when it comes to
Mm.
physical activity? What's the first thing that comes to your mind?
I don't know if this counts as an emotion. I hope it does. I want to choose purpose, and that sounds it sounds like a sort of fairly formula, or should be joy or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
But I in my personal life and in my professional life, I get purpose
Mm-hmm.
from physical activity. I get purpose from it individually and personally, because I am a man in my mid to, still mid, more than late 50s. I've been through a journey where I fundamentally have stopped participating in organised sport to greater and
Mm-hmm.
lesser extents. It no longer is part of my life in the way that I would like it to be, perhaps, but also simply can't. So the importance of remaining physically active has increased.
Mm-hmm.
And that's both for my health and well-being, but also for my connection to how it fits into the rest of my day and the responsibilities I've got. So I definitely feel purposeful as an emotion
Mm-hmm.
when I think about physical activity. I want it to be part of my life, but I also want it to make sense in my life as it sits now. And then it brings purpose too, because that is why I'm getting up in the morning currently professionally. It is to understand what sport and physical activity, and it's important that we link the two, whilst also recognizing that the ultimate goal is a more active nation. The purpose of what I'm seeking to achieve while I'm in this role.
So it's a really interesting one. We have a real mix of emotions when it comes in. It's a very valid emotion. It definitely counts.
Mm.
I would say dreading it to buzzing
Mm.
about taking part is the first thing that comes. For me, it's I quite closely align with purpose without physical activity. When I stopped
Mm.
playing team sport, my mental health took a real dive, and I couldn't figure out what it was until I realized it was not necessarily sport itself; it was the team part of that. So I had to
Yeah.
find that again. But in terms of purpose, do you feel there's ever been a time where you've lost that sense of purpose, and how did that feel?
Yeah, I mean, for a long time, I mean, I joined the sort. I've been in the sports sector for 20 years,
Mm-hmm.
and so for that period, it's had a direct relationship. I've had a direct relationship with sport at high performance level in an administrative capacity. I hasten to add, I had 7 years at UK Sport, and then I was the chief executive of the British Paralympic Association for 7 years before joining Sport England,
Mm-hmm.
and it becomes immensely wrapped up in your life when you're working in that environment, particularly the BPA, Paralympics GB,
Mm-hmm.
being such a phenomenal organisation for social benefit, alongside it being a phenomenal organisation for performing and competing at major international competitions. So prior to that, though, it was a very different relationship. It was more distant in
Mm-hmm.
terms of purpose. I played sport a lot when I was young. I was never very good at anything. I'm quite sort of, social club competitive at table tennis. I,
Mm-hmm.
like to
Oh,
think
I've
that,
heard you've
but
done
then
well. I've heard on the colleagues game.
but then when you think that, and then you come up against somebody who actually can play the game at a decent level, and you realize you're playing a completely, but beyond one or two things like that, it was always only for recreation. I then went through a stage that lots of parents will do when you have children, in my case, sons, who were going through their sporting journey as young people. So I ran touch lines and helped put cones out for football. And I particularly, actually, my older son did row for a period of time. And I learned to, and then drove the coaching launch for his rowing club. So I was
Nice.
contributing in a more volunteer way. And now at this stage, it is much more about just the basic purpose of being physically active to help me be as fit as I can be and stay as
Mm-hmm.
fit as I can be in what is quite a relentless life. And I make no apology for the fact that one of the other emotions I considered was kind.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to be kind to myself about my physical activity, because it's very easy to beat myself up and say, why aren't I doing more, or why aren't I prioritizing more? But actually, in the current time, I think I'm more realistic about what I can do and what purpose it can bring me. And I hope that comes through in my day-to-day relationship with it.
There's a few interesting points there. I think being kind to yourself as well, in terms of a relationship with physical activity. I think if you're within the sector, there is a light shining on you. And with me and my friends, my friendship circle, I've told them I'm doing the London Marathon. It's just assume that, of course, that's something Alex is going to do, because I'm the one in the sports sector. It doesn't mean I can't.
You're the sporty one.
I'm the sporty one of the friendship group and the family. So it's just assumed that I'll be running marathons, doing ultras and all these kind of stuff, when really they're just as big a milestones. I've always said in every activity that I do, my mental game is my weakness. And so the thought of a marathon and treading for that long is mentally a challenge. But it's harder for people to understand, because they go, well, you can run that distance. But so I'm interested to know as well what your relationship with physical activity looks like going through education, because you didn't take the sporty route through education.
No.
You went through the route of drama and English. So what potentially did your relationship with physical activity look like while studying, was going through your degree?
At that level, by that point, I did an English and drama degree, and in fact I have a master's degree in drama. I probably am the only sports administrator possibly in the world that can probably state that that's where
I love it.
I didn't follow a traditional route, and for 20 years of my career, nearly now, I worked outside of sport in wider roles in sort of public relations, public affairs, and communications, and that was my routine. And so when I was studying, it wasn't as so many of my colleagues have wonderfully done, and I see now either people who were at an equivalent age competing at a very high level. So I've got a chair at the moment who's probably one of the most profoundly important Olympians we've ever had, in Chris Boardman. I mean, he, relative to other cyclists, didn't win a whole bucket of medals, but he was the one that proved it was possible.
Yeah.
And he was the one that broke the mold, and he was the one that, was a relentless searcher for perfection in his sport, and recognizing that is a very, what he was doing when he was at that age versus what my relationship, you can't compare. But equally, as you know, Alex, got lots of colleagues who were extraordinarily engaged in playing sport and competing various levels at that time. For me, it was recreational even then. So through university, it was recreational. I lost the time. My chosen interest in and passion for sort of drama and theatre, which led to quite a lot of performance, that's quite time consuming.
Yeah.
So relative to the ability to go off and play, particularly cricket, which is a game I've always loved, I would say that was possibly when I transitioned from playing a lot of sport to loving what sport is and watching sport and what role sport can play, and starting to think about being more active. So at that time, I can remember, this was a long time ago, but I can remember during my studies, for example, we didn't quite have the gym culture then that we've got now, but I would go for runs and just, stay fit. Whereas I wasn't playing university sport.
Yeah.
Wouldn't have been. I played some recreational sport. I mean, I was part of a football team through the whole period of my studies, for example, but it was very five-a-side.
But yeah, that's not necessarily a bad thing as well. I didn't take part in any university sport. It wasn't for me. I'm always, ability wise, and also I've used university as an outlet to meet friends and socialize, and I prioritize that. I think what is interesting as well is when we spoke to our RuPaul's Drag Race ago, we spoke about the how much physical activity is in drama and in theatre and in their case drag, and how much being on stage and acting and performing for an hour requires you to be physically fit.
So phenomenally so. I mean, I wouldn't, again, that's at a level which wouldn't have claimed to be. But I mean, we, for example, as a sidebar to our main studies, we did a Tai Chi course, because that ability to have strength and balance and physical coordination is an element of performance, definitely. So there is overlap. I think the biggest overlap for me, though, actually was that sense of connection that you have to others.
Yeah.
that sense of engagement in a common purpose, that sense of, to a degree, performance, and providing for other people. So there are lots of overlaps in that bit of it that helped me subsequently. But it did at university mean that I started to lose something of the. I still went home. One of the sports that mattered to me in my youth, which I still like, was I played. My dad played golf,
Mm,
so I would play golf with my dad, and
amazing.
that was something that when I was on my school holidays, I would play golf with my dad. But I wouldn't go to university and and I didn't. I
Mm,
didn't play golf at university, so I became itinerant in my actual sporting context. I guess what I never lost is the thing that ultimately led to me applying for and being brilliantly fortunate enough to get the job at UK Sport, which is in 2004, a long time ago now, was my love of it
yeah.
and my knowledge, therefore, of it in a way that I'd followed it
Mm,
consistently. And whether that's really important to where I've ended up now, because it gave me a connection to. I had a job at that time which I determined was one that was I just wasn't motivated. I
yeah.
didn't have purpose, to go back to what we were talking about. I didn't have
Mm,
any purpose other than the salary that I was earning. And I wanted to go and work somewhere where the actual purpose of the organisation was a motivation. And I was very, very lucky that that turned out to be UK Sport.
amazing. And so I'm picking on a few things there. One, I could talk about golf all day, so we're going to have to do that outside of this.
Yeah, we'll do that very happily.
I've
Yeah.
picked up golf since I've been retired from American football, and I'm obsessed with it. So we'll talk about that outside of this. The one part which was interesting is that you used to play golf with your dad, and that links to the next section around your earliest memory of being physically active.
Mm.
Is there an early memory of being physically active that you can remember?
Yes, there is actually. It's probably not the first thing that we did. My father was quite a quite a heavy influence on me.
Mm-hmm.
He was a very good cricketer, my father, and then subsequently golfer. Well, not that good at golf, but he was a very good cricketer. And he had a love of sport generally. But I can remember, and I think I would probably have been about 7 or 8. We were coming up to the annual cross country race at school, and there was such a thing then. And I can remember where we lived, there was a sort of block that you could run round that would take about 2 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And it was probably only a few times, but it felt like a lot to me. I can remember going out and doing maybe 3 or 4 of those blocks with him standing outside our house with a stopwatch and just, sending me off, watching me come round the top and run down to him, shout out the time for one lap, send me off again.
Amazing.
And actually, that sounds dreadful, but it was wonderful because he got me into a place where when the actual race came along, I did, there was a dispute whether I can remember who I lost to, but there was a dispute as to whether I came second or third in the race that
Ooh.
year. I maintained second, but apparently I was passed just on the line by slowing down. But so my earliest memory is of just being in some way in a position where, yeah, it sounds a bit enforced, but actually it was
Mm,
it was him imbuing in me, the need to take stuff seriously if you're
mm,
going to do it enough, but also never putting pressure on. I mean, if I'd turned around and said, no, thanks, I don't want to do this, it wouldn't have been a problem at all. But because I said I wanted to get to that point, he was just there with his
yeah.
stopwatch. Um, and similarly, him, throwing tennis balls at me in the garden to try and get me to play forward defence. I think he's the result why I never learned to score runs particularly, but I was quite hard to get out because
Yeah.
he taught me a forward defence. So I think that my early memories are about my father, actually, not school, but actually my father.
That's amazing. I thought we talk about cross country, and you said it early enough. I was also in my cross country team. I was quite lucky to
Mhm.
have Richmond Park on my school's doorstep. So we used to
Okay, yeah.
after school we used to run around Richmond Park. So that made me interested in running because otherwise I wouldn't have been. It was such
Also a lovely place to run round. I did the Richmond 10K one year, and
yeah.
it's lovely.
It's beautiful,
Yeah.
beautiful place. So
Mm.
you say it's a link to your dad, and that you would do the laps. It sounds like even in the few things you've said today, even though you've never, it doesn't seem like you take yourself too seriously. It seems like a bit of structure and competitiveness is important to you when you think about physical activity as well.
Not anymore.
Not anymore.
No, I'm realistic. It goes back to that being kind. Now it's just about my relationship with physical activity now is very much in the health and well-being space. And actually, and we count this, and we absolutely should count this, but probably the most constant physical activity in my life now is dog walking, because it's so important to do, but also it is such a regular feature. And instead of beating myself up and suggesting that I should be, playing five-a-side football midweek or joining a golf club or actually I haven't got that space in my life right now. I've chosen to live quite a long way from London, which means that I spend quite a lot of time, either on a train or away from home, and regularity that's required for the commitment of playing isn't there. But what can be there is regular physical activity. So what I am, though, is innately, I hope this sounds as benign as I think it is, competitive. So even though I might not be very good, hence the table tennis, I still like to sort of, try and do of my best when I'm in something like that.
Be the best version of yourself.
Best advice I've ever heard, the best thing I always say to anyone whenever I do a talk or a lecture or anything, particularly about careers, was Abraham Lincoln, who said, whatever you are, be a good one. I mean, it is the best advice you can give anyone, and that sort of tries to extend to my, thinking about anything that might involve some element of competition. But I've lost all that sense of having it in real terms in my life. I'm still very privileged that I'm surrounded by it. So what I have been able to do over the years is be surrounded by extraordinary committed competition, and learn from that and the people that do it. If you have Lauren, you mentioned Lauren as one. I'm sure you've had others as well. The athletes that I've encountered, particularly in the Paralympic context.
Jordan Wiley's been on the podcast.
Okay, excellent.
So yeah,
good stuff. I'm in a very good company. The reality of being in that proximity. I made a very clear statement at the start of my time at the BPA, was that I would never wear a tracksuit in anger, because I was never credible in that environment. And it was one of the best decisions I made. I was the administrator there to make it possible for others, and I got a huge amount of reward from that. But it probably demonstrates to you, the answer to your question is no, the competitive urge is not there in terms of sport, but the love of it is. And now I'm very much, my relationship to what you want to talk about, which is, physical activity more generally, is quite personal.
So perfectly going on from physical activity into physical inactivity. This is the new, hopefully exciting part of the podcast, where we are going to be starting this causal map. So for those listening, a causal map, what it tries to do is we talk about inactivity, then we ask people, groups, and we're putting this out to our LinkedIn network, what the causes are. And then when we get that first layer, we then dig into them and keep digging into them until we find really specific reasons for inactivity. And then we discuss as a group how we can potentially resolve them. So that's hopefully the aim of this new series, is to see what potential change we can make by being an online social media based, podcast based community, which hopefully is an exciting thing. So if you were going to start out mapping the causes of inactivity, where does your thought process start?
Well, there's a tempting answer, which is to say I am privileged to be able to access great reams of information about the causes of physical activity and have seen it firsthand, in my role. I mean, the reality is little of this now for me is personal. I have a huge professional reflection on the causes of inactivity. But actually, there is one profound bit of it that is personal to everyone. The mix that we work to, and I think it's right, is that behaviour is obviously driven by, it's what you'll know of, Alex, is the combi model. That behaviour is a mix of confidence, of opportunity, and motivation. And the biggest single failing we've done historically, I think, as a nation, let alone as a sports sector, is to believe that the primary driver of inactivity is motivation, that people just don't want to do it. I think that's not only wrong, I think it's a failing of understanding. If you're in a community where there is very, very little facility base, or it's not safe to be out on the streets potentially, or you don't have the income that can enable you the time and the space to think about it, or you have a physical impairment or multiple physical or other conditions that limit your capacity to exercise, then the opportunity of being physically active is a massive limiting factor. And obviously, also in the driver that we've identified in trying to be more holistic about what physical activity means and can count, historically, we've also defined it through competence as well. So, you know, to be physically active, you need to be able to play a forehand or kick a football well, or, you know, badminton or squash, or some of these, you know, some of these technical sports, which are brilliant to play, but are not easily accessible to people for whom they're not part of their natural life. So I've thought a lot clearly about, and we've got evidence from active life surveys and elsewhere, that the historic stubborn inequality in the data is that we have historically served 2/3 of this nation pretty well to be active. 60 odd percent, currently, isn't it, around 60, 66 of the nation do 150 minutes a week, which, if we are all going to go via the definition for activity, that's what the chief medical officer says is an active life. But then you take it down to inactivity, which is doing less than 30 minutes in a week, 30 minutes in a life that of basically any activity that raises your heartbeat and is done to a moderate intensity. Well, then surely we've got to understand why it is that people feel they can't even do that. And that's about a quarter of the population currently. So we're failing. We're failing them. I don't think it's their failure to be motivated necessarily. Motivation comes from opportunity, and it comes from the sense that it makes sense to you in the, you know, we meet people where they're at rather than them coming to us. And I think the biggest, so let's talk, when we talk about inactivity, let's talk barriers. What are we putting up as a society? In the same way that, you know, if you're familiar with across the variants of the medical and the social models of disability, the medical model of disability was a basis of defining disability about what the impairment that the individual has limits them from doing. The social model reverses that and says, what are the barriers that are put in place by society that prevent someone with that impairment from accessing stuff? I'm a huge believer in the social model, therefore, and I think it applies to activity more broadly. Instead of thinking, what are the limitations of the individual? What actually have we, you know, what barriers have we put in place societally to make it harder? And whether that's social economic circumstance or in other forms of inclusion, whether it's facilities and opportunities, whether it's outside space that's safe and welcoming, whether it's community-based, you know, interactions, whether it's, more importantly, people feeling that it's good for them, understanding why, recognizing that anything counts, recognizing that any activity will benefit them if they do it in a way that's sustained and you know, timely. All of that is a social barrier that we can remove if we work differently to do so. I put motivation down the list, and I think it's one of the biggest lessons that we can all learn, where those of us that care about a more active, healthier, happier nation, is that we've got to work to remove those barriers before we start to point the fingers at inactive people and say, why don't you do more?
I've just got caught out in listening mode there rather than being in interview mode, because I completely agree with a lot of what you've just spoken about. I think barriers is something that I've always been interested in. Even my dissertation at university was around barriers specifically for females and those going through from university age into adult life, that 19 to 25. That's why this scale can's of huge interest to me personally. I think the part which I'm interested in there is we talk about the COM-B model, and you very clearly seem to be focusing on the opportunity part of the COM-B model, and that's something that you seem quite well, whether we call it personally or professionally passionate about. That's the area which, if we were going to narrow down into one, you would potentially focus on. And then from that, we speak about the social model. If we're going to say next steps in our mapping, we've got, if we say physical activity in the middle, then opportunity. Where does your brain then go in terms of how can we then start addressing activity and opportunity? How do we create branches off that? Where does your thinking go?
straight away to an understanding that imposition of opportunity is the wrong approach. It has to be created for people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very different. Straight away, it goes to, therefore, the levers that I have and we have at Sport England at our disposal, but more importantly, why as a strategic imperative in Uniting the Movement. I make no apologies for reversing back to Uniting the Movement because it's fundamentally a strategy to support this agenda wholeheartedly, was a realization that unless you work collaboratively and collectively and locally, you're always going to have barriers because you'll not address the structural or systemic barriers that exist. I have a brilliant example. I'll try and remember the numbers, but talking to someone about the young people in a secondary school in Bristol yesterday, and after school, only 11%, I think it was, I haven't got the numbers in front of me, but only about 11% of young people after school were involved in some form of sport or physical activity.
Mm-hmm.
And the biggest single reason for that was that where they were and where their school was situated and where they lived, it did not feel safe.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you can't invest in creating sport and physical activity opportunities without acknowledging that there is a bigger, more systemic barrier there in that example, which is actually the communities in which people are living. So how can you work to engage that community directly so that they create opportunities that do feel safe? And that will be often about trust. And it will be about getting the right people involved. And it will be finding those organizations who those communities can work with, as opposed to believing that, in a different phrase, build it and they will come. Whether it's a building, a facility, or whether it's a group, just provide it and people will then use it. There are so many other determining factors. That's why opportunity is so key. So I definitely think that that's where we should start, which is the understanding that we need to turn the telescope around. And instead of thinking we're looking down on the problem and coming up with solutions, we ask the problem, we try and get the problem to come to us, if you like, with what we can do differently. And I think that's a very important work. If we talk about Sport England for a moment, we're putting a huge amount of money in the next 5 years into sustained investment into working locally, place-based working, because it's hard. It requires real collaboration as opposed to sort of superficial collaboration. Very good phrase I heard once that, good collaboration is a contact sport. And I think you've used that in your pod. And
Yes.
You said something which I had in your LinkedIn post, about your time 2 years at Sport England. It can be exhausting because it is relentless, because it's competition. It's a collaborative sort of exercise. But it's true that if you're going to properly work with people in a way where you are changing things, you have to be properly engaged with them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we've had a superficial relationship with it for too long. So my principle, my starting point for this is, how do you, in order to address the barriers, how do you first understand them?
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're doing a lot more than we ever have before to work to that as a sector. And I think Uniting the Movement's belief that that is the only way that we are ever going to tackle and hopefully reduce, if not remove, the stubborn inequalities that exist in activity. We have to start there.
I think there's a really interesting point there, because I want to bring back to an interview you did in 2019. You were 3 months into the role.
Yeah.
And no, it's good. It's a good thing. There's a lot of links here. You said that you wanted to focus on 3 Ps, one being purpose. And it's quite interesting that is also how you find your personal emotion when it comes to activity. There's a huge link there between how you apply your work and your personal emotions to activity. So there's an amazing link there, which I've just seen. But then the other 2 areas that you said you wanted future work to be focused on back in 2019 was around people and place. So there were your 3 Ps, and you can clearly see that what you're saying when you're talking about Uniting the Movement strategy, when you're talking about how you would start to address barriers. Your message hasn't changed.
No, I haven't said purpose, people and place for a while. When we started out on the consultation for what became Uniting the Movement, that was my working title for the strategy.
Okay.
But you're absolutely right. The principles behind it, and if there's a 4th P, it's partnership. So it's an acknowledgement that actually you can't do it alone. But it was the very clear realization in the work that we were doing, but also all my understanding from a personal and professional perspective that, that everything happens in a place. That's a very easy thing to say,
Mm-hmm.
but it's true that it can't happen without the people that can make it a place that people want to be engaged. And there needs to be a reason for it.
Mm-hmm.
So purpose, people, and place was a very, for me, simple way of describing how we needed to work differently. Because a lot of, like I say, we had really served quite well a proportion of the population for quite a long time,
Mm-hmm.
because those things sort of fitted naturally into their lives, or were able to do so. We were fundamentally, in doing that, not addressing those for whom purpose and people and place were not
Mm-hmm.
there. And for me, not least as the stewarding of public money, that seemed unfair. So, when it comes to our investment now, you can make a direct correlation to the brilliant work that's done in the health service and sector. Many people, I'm sure, will be familiar with, Michael Marmot, the sort of health guru in
Mm-hmm.
terms of the philosophy of how you should provide for public health. And he came up with the phrase of, proportionate universalism as a very simple metric for how you choose to invest public money in this case, which is that everyone should have it available to them. We shouldn't exclude anyone from the opportunity, in our case, to be active and play sport. But let's not pretend it's a level playing field. So the disproportionate focus should be in investing in those that need it
Mm-hmm.
most. So in the same way that in healthcare, not everyone should have the opportunity to be healthy and access healthcare, but patently some people require it much more directly than others, and certain communities rather than others. So you are disproportionately focused on them. We've taken that and applied it to sport and physical activity. And it was through the lens of recognizing purpose, people, and play. I feel quite nice hearing it again, actually. It's still very fundamental to our work. We just moved on in terms of some of the language we use. But purpose is the central theme of uniting the movement. We all are very fixated on place and place-based, working in place.
Mm-hmm.
And we know how important people are to that. So it still exists.
So there's even a few bits there. I think throughout what we're talking about with opportunity, if we're digging into that, everything we've spoken about really has been around collaboration, collective action, how we're working collaboratively in place, and even yourself saying adding the extra P of partnerships. How,
Mm.
in terms of working collaboratively and addressing inequalities, how do you feel we are currently doing, and what do you feel we're learning from in terms of reducing inactivity through working collaboratively?
Yeah. Look, I try not to overemphasize my positivity because we've got huge challenges
Mm-hmm.
moving forward. But I have witnessed in the 5 years, but particularly in the 3 years since uniting the movement, a genuine intent for organisations to work better and more effectively together. And whether that's governing bodies of sport, but it's more pertinently, you can see within the active partner network that sport has across the country, a real groundswell of intent. I think we've managed to shift people's mindset
Mm-hmm.
towards the opportunities and the benefits that come from working collaboratively, and recognizing that no single organization or no single sport or no single part of our sector will ever independently be able to resolve the challenges that we collectively face. Where I think there are real next stage hurdles to overcome is where we are now, which is twofold. How do you translate that sentiment into action? How do you move from having a shared belief that collaboration is a good idea to actually doing it well?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that that's a bad place to be, but it is absolutely the sort of key metric now for success. I think people are more willing to talk about a collaborative approach and
Mm-hmm.
get into rooms together to talk about how they might work together, but actually coming away with something that's genuinely different is a different thing.
Oh.
And secondly, to that point, the honest appraisal led by, particularly I think in our case, our sort of ambition and purpose of, reaching those in our community who've been less well served, to recognise that some of that partnership needs to be with new and different organisations to those which historically
Mm-hmm.
we've worked with, and to think about the unusual suspects in our relationships as opposed to the usual suspects in our relationships and how that can change.
Yeah.
That said, it's a movement, And I am absolutely committed. And one of my personal measures of success for uniting the movement, and the whole premise of your questioning and getting people more active, is everybody on the path. Because, traditional national governing bodies of sport still play a fundamental and key role in activity in this country. And how much better it would be if they've actually got a much better lens, for example, on some of those organisations using their sport for social change. So if you've got Brighton Table Tennis Club down doing this amazing stuff that it is in Brighton in getting people to play, how well connected are they actually to what Table Tennis England are thinking? I keep coming back to table tennis. I don't know why, but we are. Basketball and the many community clubs, or England boxing and the many community clubs that use sports like basketball and boxing to engage young people particularly. And then you link that through the sort of local relationships that can be partnered and brokered, not least through the Active Partner Network. And then you think about the local authority and other publicly owned and privately owned leisure sector, and the role that a UK Active or someone like that can play in helping them to come much more to the table, so that if we do a campaign like This Girl Can, it actually has resonance and meaning beyond where it was before, because you can see it live and living in those facilities. So that sense of working with everybody in the sector mustn't ever go away. But our point and our challenges right now is we're only going to move the dial if we think about and work with unusual suspects.
Completely agree. I think that's why in my previous role at the YMCA, I was really interested in us working with public health and their whole systems approach, and that everything around United the Movement talks to the stages of whole system change, whole systems approach. Exactly. So when I saw Sport England were moving that way, and that was my next future role, I was quite excited. It felt like timing was good for me, because I'd stumbled across this systems approach just naturally in my role, and then it came that Sport England doing that.
And we're still learning, absolutely. But it is fascinating, and for me personally, I mean, I think interesting for me and Sport England, and sitting here and looking at our role, and we have a very important role and responsibility in sport, as the community and grassroots investor, but also as the sports council. That brings with it some authority and some responsibilities that we take very, very seriously. But equally, some of my favourite partnerships. I mean, you mentioned YMCA, working with YMCA, working with the National Trust and the Forestry Commission and the Canal and Rivers Trust. Thinking about the places and the spaces people are active, as well as what their activity is. They're fascinating partnerships, very different, but so aligned around common purpose. Or look at, as a last point, the sort of 15 or so charities that make up the Richmond Group that collectively account for millions of people as beneficiaries who are living with at least one long-term health condition. They're really important partners for us as charities. So people like the Stroke Association and Diabetes UK and Parkinson's and Rethink Mental Illness and British Heart Foundation and Mind. These are all people we've built a partnership and a relationship with and a collaboration with, because they have got members of their communities who are demonstrably finding it harder to be active and feel the benefit of that in their lives. Our partnership can help drive that and actually create the change we're trying to see. So a fascinating outcome for me in whole system change is what it brings to the table.
So just summarizing for today, what I'd like to throw out to the LinkedIn network is if we're building this map, we've said that the first routes off of that map is going to be for yourself is the COM-B model. And so that's one arm, and within that we're saying we wanted to focus today on opportunity. I think it'd be really interesting for the community to really dig into that. We've spoken about some things today around collaboration, place-based working, understanding place, developing partnerships. So my challenge to those listening and to the community is to figure out, okay, thinking about those areas, whether it be working in place or collaboration, what do you feel are the causes of inactivity within them? Or do you feel passionately about addressing inactivity in a different way, which isn't just about opportunity? I think that's what will be really interesting in the next phase, in what the what the listeners and sector feel. Do you have any feeling
No,
about what will
I
come
would
out
be
of that?
really fascinated too. I was really fascinated too, and I don't underestimate the fact that necessarily we've probably gone down one path.
Mm-hmm.
But the easy common denominator to consider in the data is the overlap of inactivity with social economic circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
So it's quite obvious from that opportunity is always going to play a factor,
Mm-hmm.
and the equalizing out of that might seem painful for some, but is a hugely necessary part of what we're about. I know I came personally from quite a privileged, background and didn't encounter any of those barriers to entry that are so apparent in so many of the communities in which we now work. And that for me is really important to recognise, and that our job is to enable everyone to have the benefits of a happy and healthy life.
I think that's an amazing place to stop. I think that's a nice way to finish this. So thank you very much for today, Tim. Hopefully that was an interesting listen for people. And please do head over to Working It Out on LinkedIn to continue the conversation. Thank you very much, Tim.
Thank you, Alex. Really enjoyed it. Thanks for asking me.